October 2001, a 16-year-old maquiladora worker named Lilia Alejandra Garcia Andrade leaves her factory shift in Ciudad Juarez and begins the walk home. She never arrives. 7 days later, her body is found in a vacant lot, raped, strangled, her left breast mutilated. The police file her case as probable domestic violence. Her mother demands answers. The authorities offer silence. Lilia was one of hundreds, and in Juarez, silence was policy. To understand how hundreds of women could vanish from a single city, you must first understand the city itself. Ciudad Juarez sits on the Rio Grande, directly across from El Paso, Texas. It is not merely a border town, it is a valve controlling the flow of goods, people, and narcotics between two nations. In the 1990s, that valve was controlled by one man, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, known as the Lord of the Skies. Under his leadership, the Juarez cartel transformed the city into something more than a trafficking corridor. It became a narco-state, a place where the line between criminal organization and municipal authority dissolved entirely. Carrillo Fuentes died in 1997 during plastic surgery, but the infrastructure he built endured. By the time Lilia Alejandra disappeared in 2001, Juarez was a city where cartel influence permeated every institution. Police commanders received monthly payments. Prosecutors answered to traffickers. Judges understood which cases to dismiss. This was not corruption in the traditional sense, isolated officers taking bribes. This was systemic capture. The cartel did not operate alongside the state, it operated as the state. Into this environment came the maquiladoras. The North American Free Trade Agreement, signed in 1994, accelerated the growth of foreign-owned factories along the border. These plants assembled electronics, auto parts, textiles, products destined for American consumers. The workforce was overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly young, overwhelmingly poor. Women migrated from rural Mexico to Juarez, drawn by the promise of wages that, while meager by American standards, represented survival. They lived in colonias, unplanned settlements without streetlights, without paved roads, without police presence. They worked long shifts, often ending after dark. They walked home alone. The first disappearances that would later be recognized as part of a pattern began in 1993. A young woman would leave work or school. She would not arrive home. Days or weeks later, her body would be found in the desert or in a vacant lot on the city's periphery. The injuries were often similar, evidence of sexual violence, strangulation, mutilation. The victims shared a profile: young, poor, dark-haired, employed in maquiladoras or attending school. They were women whose absence would not immediately trigger institutional response. Women whose families lacked the resources or connections to demand accountability. By 2005, non-governmental organizations had documented over 370 confirmed murders of women in Juarez. Some estimates, accounting for disappearances never resolved, exceed 2,500 across the following decades. The numbers are contested, in part because the state never maintained reliable records. But the pattern was undeniable. Women were being abducted, raped, killed, and discarded. And the machinery of justice was doing nothing. To understand why requires understanding the psychology of disposability. In the cartel-controlled economy of Juarez, women occupied a specific position. They were labor, cheap, replaceable, necessary for the maquiladoras that legitimized the city's economy. They were also, in the eyes of many men operating within or adjacent to cartel culture, property. Cartel members treated women as trophies, as rewards, as collateral in disputes. This was not unique to Juarez, but the concentration of cartel power and the influx of vulnerable women created a permission structure. Misogyny, amplified by impunity, became lethal. The perpetrators, whether cartel members, police officers, or civilians operating in the shadow of cartel control, understood that certain lives carried no legal consequence. The victims were poor. They were migrants. They had no political power. Their families could not hire lawyers or bribe officials. In the calculus of Juarez, these women were disposable, and disposability once established invites predation. Norma Andrade, Lilia's mother, came to this realization slowly. When her daughter disappeared, she believed it was an isolated tragedy. When the police dismissed the case, she believed it was incompetence. But as she began searching for answers, she encountered other mothers. Women holding photographs of daughters who had also vanished. Women who had also been told their cases were closed, or that their daughters had run away, or that the evidence had been lost. Norma understood then that Lilia's murder was not an anomaly. It was policy. The operational mechanisms that enabled this mass femicide were not complex. They were brutally simple. Crime scenes were contaminated or ignored. Officers arrived hours late, allowing evidence to degrade. Bodies were misidentified, sometimes deliberately. Autopsies were cursory or falsified. Case files disappeared. Witnesses were not interviewed or were intimidated into silence. When pressure mounted, from families, from activists, from international observers, the state produced arrests. In 1995, authorities arrested an Egyptian chemist named Abdel Latif Sharif, accusing him of multiple murders. He was convicted and imprisoned, but the killings continued. In 1999, police arrested members of a gang called Los Rebeldes, claiming they were responsible for murders committed while Sharif was incarcerated. Confessions were obtained. Later, those confessions were revealed to have been coerced through torture. Convictions were overturned. The pattern repeated. Arrests, confessions, trials, and then the quiet acknowledgement that the wrong men had been imprisoned. The state was not solving crimes, it was performing the appearance of justice. Intelligence analysts who later reviewed the cases suggest that the police were not merely incompetent, they were complicit. Some officers were directly involved in abductions, others provided protection for perpetrators, still others destroyed evidence to shield cartel-linked actors. The conviction rate for femicides in Juarez hovered around 2%. This was not failure. This was design. The question of who killed these women has generated multiple theories. The first is the serial killer hypothesis. The similarities in victim profile, method, and disposal suggest a single perpetrator or a small group operating with consistent methodology. Sharif was presented as this figure, though the evidence against him was circumstantial and the murders continued after his arrest. Some investigators believed Los Rebeldes were responsible, though again, the timeline did not align. The serial killer theory is compelling because it offers narrative simplicity, a monster, a hunt, a resolution, but it does not account for the scale or the institutional failure. The second theory involves organized criminal networks producing violent pornography. Rumors circulated in Juarez that women were being abducted for snuff films, recordings of sexual violence and murder sold to wealthy buyers. Journalists investigated these claims. No confirmed evidence of such a network has ever been produced. The theory persists because it explains the mutilation and the apparent coordination, but it remains speculative. The third theory is the most supported by available evidence. The femicides were the byproduct of cartel control and the opportunistic predation it enabled. Cartel members, police officers, and civilians operating under the umbrella of impunity committed murders individually or in small groups. Some victims were killed by men with direct cartel ties. Others were killed by men who understood that the cartel-controlled environment meant no investigation would follow. The murders were not centrally coordinated, but they were structurally enabled. The who mattered less than the why it was allowed. One can assume that for perpetrators, the act of killing carried no perceived risk. They operated in a city where the state had abdicated its responsibility to protect its most vulnerable citizens. They understood that even if arrested, confessions could be coerced from scapegoats. They knew that families lacked the resources to pursue justice. The femicides were not the work of a single mastermind. They were the logical outcome of a system that had decided certain lives did not matter. Norma Andrade refused to accept that logic. In 2001, she co-founded Nuestras Hijas de Regreso, a casa, May Our Daughters Return Home. The organization documented cases, organized protests, and demanded that authorities acknowledge the scale of the violence. Norma and other mothers carried photographs of their daughters through the streets of Juarez. They held vigils. They filed complaints with international human rights bodies. They became, in effect, the only investigators their daughters would ever have. The state responded with violence. In 2008, Norma's son, Sergio Rafael, was murdered. He was shot multiple times outside the family home. Authorities suggested it was gang-related. Norma believed it was retaliation. In 2011, she survived an assassination attempt. Gunmen opened fire on her car. She was struck, but lived. Other activists were not as fortunate. Maricela Escobedo, a mother who had spent years demanding justice for her daughter's murder, was shot dead outside the governor's palace in 2010. Journalists covering the femicides received death threats. Some fled the country, others were killed. The mothers' movement became a counter-narrative to the state's silence. They refused to let their daughters be forgotten. They named the dead. They preserved testimony. They transformed private grief into public demand. In doing so, they exposed the machinery of impunity. The state could ignore individual families. It could not ignore organized, sustained resistance. International pressure mounted. Human rights organizations documented the failures. The United Nations issued reports. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled in 2009 that Mexico had violated its obligations to protect women and investigate their murders. To fully grasp the femicides, one must situate them within broader political and economic structures. The philosopher Akila Mbembe coined the term necropolitics to describe the state's power to decide who lives and who dies, who is protected and who is abandoned. In Juarez, the state exercised necropolitical power by choosing not to protect poor women. Their deaths were not accidental. They were the result of decisions made at every level of governance: to underfund police, to tolerate corruption, to dismiss cases, to prioritize cartel interests over human life. The economic context is equally critical. NAFTA and the maquiladora system created a labor force that was both essential and expendable. These women were necessary for the factories to function, but they were not valued as individuals. They were units of production. When they were killed, the factories did not close. New workers arrived. The system continued. Neoliberal economic policy, which prioritized profit and deregulation, produced a population of vulnerable, exploitable people. The femicides were not external to this system. They were its shadow. Narcopolitics, the exercise of political power by drug trafficking organizations, further eroded state authority. In Juarez, the cartel did not merely challenge the state, it replaced it. The state's monopoly on violence, the foundational claim of sovereignty, was ceded to criminal organizations. In this environment, the femicides were both symptom and symbol. They demonstrated that the state could not or would not protect its citizens. They revealed the gendered logic of violence in a narco-state. Women's bodies became sites of terror, trophies, and disposal. The femicides were not an aberration. They were the logical outcome of structural violence, the intersection of misogyny, class exploitation, cartel control, and state failure. The women of Juarez were rendered disposable by every system that touched their lives. And when they were killed, those same systems ensured that no one would be held accountable. After 2005, international attention forced some reforms. The Mexican government created specialized prosecutors' offices. Training programs were implemented. Protocols for investigating gender-based violence were introduced. But the violence did not stop. Between 2008 and 2012, Juarez became the most violent city in the world, not because of femicides alone, but because of a broader cartel war. The Sinaloa cartel, led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, challenged the Juarez cartel for control of the plaza. Thousands died. The femicides continued, but they were obscured by the sheer scale of homicide. In the 2010s and 2020s, femicide remained epidemic across Mexico. Juarez still records some of the highest rates in the country. The conviction rate remains around 2%. Most cases are never solved. Families still search for missing daughters. Activists still demand accountability. University archives and non-governmental organizations continue to document the dead, preserving testimony and evidence that the state has failed to collect. The machinery of impunity once built is difficult to dismantle. It is sustained by corruption, by indifference, by the structural devaluation of certain lives. In Juarez, that machinery was constructed over decades. It was built by cartels and police, by prosecutors and politicians, by an economic system that treated women as disposable labor, and by a culture that treated their deaths as inevitable. But the mothers refused inevitability. Norma Andrade, despite the murder of her son and the attempt on her own life, continued her work. She and others like her became the memory of a city that preferred to forget. They carried photographs. They spoke names. They insisted that their daughters mattered. In a system designed to erase, they preserved. In a city built on silence, they spoke. The femicides of Ciudad Juarez reveal a fundamental truth about power and justice. When the state decides that certain lives are not worth protecting, it creates the conditions for mass atrocity. When impunity becomes policy, predators operate without fear. When women are rendered disposable by economics, by culture, by law, their deaths become routine. The question is not only who killed these women. The question is why an entire system allowed it to happen. Why hundreds of murders could occur in a single city over decades with almost no one held accountable. Why the machinery of justice, which exists in theory to protect the vulnerable, instead protected the powerful. The mothers of Juarez understood that justice in their city was reserved for those who could afford it. For everyone else, There was only silence. But silence is not neutral. It is a choice. And in choosing silence, the state chose complicity. What does it mean when a government cannot or will not protect its own citizens? What does it mean when the lives of poor women are treated as expendable? What does it mean when the machinery of impunity is so entrenched that even international condemnation cannot dismantle it? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions that Norma Andrade and hundreds of other mothers have been asking for decades. They are the questions that remain unanswered. Share your thoughts below.